is, what you see is the shaman jumps up and jumps in the fire and sits there. So, when they talk about mountains, lake and frost, or that you've done fire walking, how people go across very quickly. This is quite different. This is like I say, he's sitting there, there's the fire, jumps up, sits there, and watches it. He was also involved in healing a number of people over there next. We saw similar things in Bhutan. Bhutan is interesting because it's the year we were there were only 11,000 visitors for the entire year. Would we blow something? It's okay with that. Next slide. And we do a fair amount of work over in Brazil, condemnation and Umbanda. And one of the big differences that I find in dealing with the Brazilian hierarchy is that they have a mindset that is very much accommodating the spiritual world, spiritual healing. Interestingly, the guy who introduced us here at Conference was a U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel who was the liaison officer there, who understood. He'd actually been born in Brazil, moved when he was 9, and had come back over. But again, the difference is that even the intelligentsia educated class have an acceptance of these sort of things that you don't see in most of the technical developed world, U.S. in particular. Next slide. Another thing we did there was this has to do with healing. Now, in the U.S., cardiac is almost unheard of. He's better known in the southern hemisphere and in the Philippines and places like that. But one other thing, Alan Kardec was the guy behind it. This is very interesting. Mary, who was the wife of the colonel, who was escorting us around, had been bedridden to the point where she was almost incapacitated. Traditional doctors had worked on her, and basically without result. One of the things of interest, we went to a service here. This was a Friday afternoon. Hundreds of people there. One of my questions was, doesn't anybody have a day job? I mean, how do you just take off in the middle of the week? The other thing that impressed me greatly, in American churches, they're always passing a hat, a dish asking for money and special offerings and that. While we were at the church and went through the whole service, not only did they not ask for money, there was even a place to give them money if you wanted to. Well, one of my questions was, how do you afford this? Because you've got some real expenses. You got to pay electrical bills and things of that nature. But again, this was one that you'll find the people working with and very effectively. Next slide. We've also been in Tibet, and we'll get into real deep trouble, but the Dalai Lama and I have some differences over what they ought to be teaching there. But one of the things that did happen, next slide, out in the Buddha, there is a belief that almost everything was destroyed during the Chinese invasion, and in fact, a fair amount was. That said, there was a lot of material that the people around the outer monasteries took out and buried, and has now been retrieved and come back. What the Chinese have done is catalog it, and so they do know what they have. You did not see that before. Again, relying in the other area almost exclusively on spiritual medicine and things of that nature. There are no medical facilities that we know of. Next one. Here's another one. This was in Zimbabwe. Again, you see here. In fact, you probably recognize the ceremony, except that she wasn't drinking ayahuasca, but almost everything else was very similar to the kinds of ceremonies that you see here. Next slide. And she ended up channeling the great uncle. This is Victoria here, can't say she actually levitated, but I will tell you that she come up off the ground and you watch the major spiritual change that took place it was the book, The Great Uncle, who was channeled at that time. Next slide. Now, one of the things that we see, if we start looking at across there's a lot of commonality in the visions. And I use this one showing the Aborigines that you see. This is an Aboriginal from Australia. Again, talking about the spirit world and the real world and the bridge between the two. Next slide. I think many of you will know Strassman's book, but I use this in other audiences. But his book is really quite interesting. He was talking, of course, about DMT, but we had invisible rooms. And the surprising thing is there's beings out there that we might interact with, which is really kind of runs against most Western tradition. Next slide. So I'm going to go now some into near-death experience. Those who don't know, at one point I was the president of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Kudla Ross, if you know her, was the head of my committee who did my dissertation. Next slide. And here's what they talk about this book stages. I'm not going to go through this too much, except to hit to one thing, there's some kind of event that gets you ostensibly close to death. By the way, one of the things I would say is as we looked at this, initially we thought near death was a short period of time, probably seconds, that somebody was, either dead or very close to it. And that was the end of the event. One of the things we learned later on was that these events go on and on. And that's why the aftermath, right? Lots of people have precognitive and psychokinetic capabilities that are developed. It's usually peaceful, the perception of all the reality, spiritual encounters, whatever. I might mention that, one of the skeptical things says, I was unconscious and nothing happened. Well, most people who are close to death and go unconscious, at least 2/3 of them have no recollection whatsoever. So no response is the norm. Having said that, about 1/3 of the people actually do have some pretty spectacular events. It's also interesting that entities can be discriminated from many other events. Most of you have had dreams, and you know that over time, dreams tend to dissipate. One of the things about the classic near-death experience is it is a critical emotional event. And I would get letters from people, 30, 40 years later, saying, I had this experience, and it's like it was yesterday, and be able to describe it in exquisite detail. One of the studies that I've done is you find that there are changes in belief systems and values, and many of the people do it. I did my dissertation. This is what made me change one word, and I used religiousness, and she made me change it to spirituality. And that turned out to be a pretty significant difference, because I was surprised at the instrument I was using how many people said, I consider myself to be a spiritual being. I reject the dogma of the church or things of that nature. And when we talk to people who have had near-death experiences, many of them talk about the same thing, the changes in spirituality. And of course, no fear of death is one of the things that is a common factor. Now, there are some fallouts from this. This is one that I knew many years ago. Barbara Harris, she had several near-death experiences. Some of them were really quite spectacular, wrote the book. But she also had problems when she went home. And that was, I put up here, where's mommy? And this was raising the kids. And she said, you've gone out, met God, talked to them, had these, life-altering experiences, and the kids want to know when's dinner going to be ready. us to go to school, and things of that nature. So a lot of people have trouble integrating back into life after these critical emotional experiences. Now, one of the things you do hear about, of course, are negative near-death experiences. Now, the most common one is for people to say, everything was cool while I was outside there, but as I came back into my body, it hurt. And so we don't put that in negative experience. That's just a matter of coming back in. There are a few people who have reported hellish visions or demons that are out there clawing at them. And some of them also just kind of an utter blackness. One of the problems that they've had from a religious perspective are people who said they've had a hellish vision. And they say, well, if I'd seen this, even if I can avoid it, I must be a bad person, or I never would have gotten there in the first place. Next slide. Some of the additional issues, we'll get to the alternatives in a minute. Bill Morris has written books, particularly on children and near-death experience. One of the problems, they say, well, it's just things that people have learned or they picked it up along the way. We now have cases of children who had NDEs when they were pre-verbal and had to, grow up and get to where they could have the language to even describe what they were doing. So they certainly weren't influenced by watching movies or television or hearing stories from other people. Another study that Ken Rink did were in people who were congenitally blind and then had near-death experiences and be able to talk about, seeing things literally as if they were a sighted person. And congenitally blind means they never could see in their life, and yet they do report accurately those sort of things. As I mentioned before, some of the aspects in precognitive. The PK thing is also problematic in that many of them can't be around sensitive electronic equipment. The people who can't be around computers to plug in, that's them. It shows up particularly as cars have gotten more sophisticated and operating closer to margination. There's a whole host of theories that are put out by the skeptics. Most of them can be shot down. They say that the seizures of the right temporal lobe or something like that is just depersonalization. It's an endorphin release or wishful thinking. I'm going to hit a few cases in just a few minutes, and I think really put most of those to rest. But those are the theories.